I walked into divorce court, ready to lose everything I had ever worked for. My cheating husband demanded the house, my company, and even our children. When my mother whispered for me to surrender it all, I did exactly that. His family laughed in my face, completely unaware that the very documents they forced me to sign were loaded with a secret that would absolutely destroy them. My name is Julia, and I am 34 years old. The air inside the downtown Chicago family courtroom was aggressively cold, carrying the faint sterile scent of floor wax and old paper. I sat frozen at the heavy oak table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their violent shaking. Across from me sat David, the man I had loved and supported for an entire decade, looking impeccably sharp in a custom Italian suit. I had paid for that suit, just like I had paid for the gold watch gleaming on his wrist and the luxury car waiting for him in the parking garage. Now he was using the wealth I had built to pay a high-priced shark-like attorney to rip my life apart. The lawyer, a man with cold eyes and a patronizing smile, aggressively slid a thick stack of divorce settlement papers across the table toward me. The sound of the heavy pages scraping against the wood echoed in the quiet room, sounding like the closing of a coffin. I looked down at the bold, unforgiving text. The demands were not just greedy, they were designed to annihilate me. David wanted the $1.5 million suburban estate we lived in. He wanted 70% of the logistics and supply chain company I had built from the ground up. And most devastatingly, he wanted primary custody of our two children, 7-year-old Leo and 5-year-old Mia. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely draw a breath. 10 years ago, I was just a girl with a single-used delivery truck and a massive dream. I drove 14 hours a day, hauling freight across state lines, sleeping in the cab of my truck to save money, showering at truck stops and skipping meals to pay for gas and maintenance. When David and I met, he was a struggling junior sales rep who claimed he wanted to build an empire with me. But while I built the actual empire, negotiating warehouse leases, securing major supply contracts, and managing a growing fleet of drivers, David played golf. He attended fancy networking lunches, drank expensive scotch, and gave himself the title of vice president, while I did the grueling, unglamorous work of keeping the business alive. Now he was claiming he was the brains behind the operation. From the gallery behind me, a sharp, abrasive laugh cut through the silence of the courtroom. It was Patricia, my smug, status-obsessed mother-in-law. I did not even need to turn around to picture her. She would be wearing her signature pearls and a designer outfit meant to intimidate everyone around her. Sitting right next to her was Brittany. Brittany was 24 years old, a former receptionist at our company, and David's mistress of over a year. Patricia leaned over to Brittany, making absolutely no effort to lower her voice. Her words were loud, calculated, and meant for my ears. I told David a decade ago not to marry a blue-collar delivery truck driver. Now she gets to go right back to the gutter where she belongs. The cruelty in her voice was a physical strike against my dignity. Patricia had never hidden her disdain for my working-class background. She came from a family of local politicians and believed wealth should be inherited, not earned with dirty hands and calloused fingers. When my logistics company finally took off and started bringing in millions, Patricia was more than happy to enjoy the perks. She gladly accepted the designer handbags I bought her for her birthdays and happily attended the lavish parties I funded. But behind my back and now right to my face, I was always just the dirty truck driver who was not good enough for her precious son. I glanced at Brittany out of the corner of my eye. The young woman was casually inspecting her manicured nails, looking entirely bored by the legal proceedings that were tearing my family apart. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that I instantly recognized. It was the same bracelet David had purchased last Valentine's Day. I had found the receipt and assumed it was a surprise for me. I never received it. Seeing it on Brittany's wrist in the middle of a courtroom was a fresh, agonizing twist of the knife. It was the ultimate display of disrespect, parading the spoils of my hard work on the wrist of the woman who destroyed my marriage. David noticed my gaze and leaned across the heavy oak table. The scent of his expensive cologne, a smell that used to bring me comfort, now made my stomach churn with nausea. He dropped his voice to a harsh, mocking whisper that only I could hear. "You need to sign the papers, Julia." Brittany has already picked out a beautiful new crib for the nursery. The oak one looks great against the paint job you did. My breath caught in my throat. The nursery. When I was pregnant with Mia, I had spent 3 weeks carefully hand-painting a delicate woodland mural on those walls. It was my labor of love, a sanctuary I created for my daughter. The thought of this 24-year-old girl casually moving her things into my home, putting a new crib into the room I had painted, and playing house with my children made a wave of absolute fury rise in my blood. The house was not just a piece of real estate. It was the home where my children took their first steps. I opened my mouth to tell him I would rather burn the house to the ground than let him take it, but David anticipated my resistance. His eyes narrowed, turning cold and ruthless. "If you fight me on this asset division, I will destroy you," he whispered, leaning even closer. His voice was a venomous hiss. "I have the doctored accounting ledgers ready to go. I will show the judge that you were funneling company funds. I will frame you as an absentee, work-obsessed mother who neglected her own kids for a paycheck. I will drag this custody battle out for years. I will bleed you dry with legal fees until you cannot even afford to buy a studio apartment. You will only see Leo and Mia on alternating weekends if the judge even allows that. Sign the papers, Julia. You lost. Accept it." The sheer malice in his eyes paralyzed me. This was the man who had promised to protect me, the man who had held my hand in the delivery room. Now he was threatening to fabricate evidence to steal my children and ruin my freedom. I knew how the legal system worked. David had cleverly positioned himself as the public face of the company in recent years, while I handled operations behind the scenes. He had the connections. He had the smooth-talking charm that judges loved. If he submitted those doctored ledgers, I would be tied up in court for the next 5 years, fighting to clear my name. My children would be dragged through a toxic, highly publicized legal battle. They would be questioned by social workers and caught in the crossfire of David's ruthless ambition. I could not do that to Leo and Mia. I could not let their childhood be defined by courtroom battles and malicious lies. I looked down at the signature line on the final page of the settlement. The stark black ink of the printed document felt like a death sentence. By signing this, I would be handing over the keys to the $1.5 million estate I had paid for. I would be surrendering control of the multi-million-dollar company I had bled for. I would be letting a cheating, narcissistic man and his arrogant mother win. The injustice of it all tasted like ash in my mouth. My vision blurred with unshed tears of rage and absolute helplessness. The judge cleared his throat from the bench, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "Are we reaching an agreement, counselor? Or do we need to schedule this for a full trial?" David's lawyer smiled a slick, predatory smile. "Just a moment, Your Honor. My client's wife is just reviewing the final terms." David pushed a silver pen across the table. It rolled smoothly and hit my knuckles. "Sign it," he mouthed silently, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. My hands began to shake violently. I gripped the heavy silver pen, feeling the cold metal against my sweating palm. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fight, to throw the pen in his face, to stand up and shout the truth to the judge. I wanted to scream that he was a fraud, that his mother was a parasite, and that Brittany was wearing a bracelet bought with stolen money. But the thought of losing my children to his fabricated evidence kept me anchored to the chair. I was completely cornered, trapped in a nightmare with no viable escape route. I lowered the pen toward the thick stack of papers, my spirit breaking under the weight of his blackmail. I prepared to surrender my entire life to the people who had betrayed me. But just as the metal nib of the pen hovered a millimeter above the signature line, I felt a sudden firm pressure on my right shoulder. I turned my head, expecting to see a court bailiff, or perhaps David's lawyer, leaning in to demand my compliance for the final kill. Instead, I saw the worn, familiar sleeve of a beige cardigan. It was my mother. Martha had been sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery for the entire morning, remaining completely invisible to the arrogant people sitting across the table from me. My mother was a woman of very few words, someone who had worked her hands to the bone, cleaning commercial office buildings, just so I could afford the down payment on my very first delivery truck. Patricia had spent my entire 10-year marriage treating my mother like the hired help, deliberately pretending she did not exist at holiday dinners, and making snide passive-aggressive comments about her discount store clothing. But my mother possessed a quiet, dangerous intelligence that Patricia's inherited wealth could never buy. She leaned down, her graying hair brushing against my cheek. I expected her to tell me to fight, to stand up for myself, to refuse to let these terrible people take what we had built with our own two hands. But her voice was barely more than a breath steady and entirely devoid of fear. "Sign it," she whispered, her fingers squeezing my shoulder with surprising strength. "Give him everything." They are too arrogant to read the attachments. For a fraction of a second, my brain short-circuited. Give him everything. Give him the estate. Give him the company. It sounded like absolute madness. But then I looked up into my mother's eyes. There was no defeat in them. There was no sadness. There was only the cold, sharp calculation of a woman who knew exactly how a devastating trap was set. My anxiety evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden icy clarity that settled deep in my chest. I looked back at David. He was practically vibrating with greed, his eyes locked intensely on the silver pen in my hand. His lawyer sat right beside him, tapping a gold watch, silently rushing me to finalize my own destruction. They thought they had me completely backed into a corner. They thought his vicious blackmail had won. David had always underestimated me, assuming my massive success was just a byproduct of his networking and charm. He never understood the sheer grit it took to build something monumental out of nothing. I took a deep breath, letting the stale courtroom air fill my lungs, and adjusted my grip on the pen. I did not hesitate. I did not tremble. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name on the very first line. Then I flipped to the next page and signed again. I signed away the $1.5 million brick house in the suburbs. I signed away 70% of the shares in the commercial logistics company I had built from scratch. I signed away the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and the joint bank accounts. With every single stroke of the pen, I felt a massive weight lifting off my chest. David leaned forward, his breathing shallow with excitement, watching me willingly hand over a decade of my blood and sweat. When I reached the final page, the custody agreement, I signed that too, knowing full well it was a temporary calculated concession in a much larger war. I pushed the heavy stack of papers back across the oak table. David snatched them up so fast he nearly tore the top page. He did not even look at the signatures to verify them. He just started flipping through the pages, a massive greedy grin spreading across his face. He had won. He had finally defeated the blue-collar delivery driver. The judge gave a sharp nod, striking his gavel against the sounding block. "The court accepts the settlement. We are adjourned." I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal skirt. I did not look at David. I did not look at his smug lawyer. I simply turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my mother matching my pace right beside me. The hallway outside the courtroom was a chaotic echo chamber of arguing lawyers and distressed families, but I could hear Patricia's voice ringing out above all of it. As my mother and I approached the elevators, a loud pop echoed through the marble lobby. Patricia had actually smuggled a miniature bottle of champagne into a federal building. She stood near the security checkpoint, pouring the bubbly liquid into two plastic cups she had pulled from her designer handbag. She handed one to Brittany, who was busy taking a selfie to commemorate the occasion. Patricia caught my eye as I waited for the elevator doors to open. She raised her plastic cup in my direction. Her face twisted into a mask of exaggerated, dripping pity. "Good luck out there, Julia," Patricia called out, making sure a passing group of attorneys heard her loud and clear. "Try not to spend it all in one place. Oh wait, you do not have anything left." I did not give her the satisfaction of a response. I simply stepped into the elevator, my mother right behind me, and let the heavy steel doors slide shut on Patricia's cackling laughter. The moment we stepped out of the courthouse and into the freezing Chicago air, the posture of a defeated woman fell away from me completely. I zipped up my wool coat and walked briskly toward the parking garage. We intentionally bypassed the premium section where David's luxury SUV was parked and walked down to the lower level where my mother's 10-year-old incredibly modest sedan was waiting. I climbed into the passenger seat while my mother started the engine. The heater blasted warm air into the small cabin, thawing my frozen fingers. I pulled my phone from my purse. My hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly dangerously still. I dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. It rang twice before a deep professional voice answered. "Is it done, Richard?" I asked. My corporate attorney sounded entirely too pleased with himself on the other end of the line. "The bait is taken, Julia. I just received the electronic filing from David's lawyer. They fast-tracked the processing just like we anticipated. They wanted you out so badly they pushed the paperwork through without a single secondary review." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked over at my mother, who was casually pulling the sedan out of the parking garage and merging into the busy downtown traffic. David just assumed full legal ownership of the shell company and the property. I said into the phone, my voice steady and cold. "Initiate the purge." "Understood," Richard replied. "The asset transfer is complete on their end. They own the liabilities. I am executing the lease terminations right now. By tomorrow morning, your ex-husband is going to wake up to a very different reality." I ended the call and tossed the phone into my purse. The logistics and supply chain company David had just fought so hard to steal was nothing more than an elaborate mirage. For the past 6 months, once I realized David was hiding money and sleeping with Brittany Richard, and I had been quietly restructuring my entire corporate empire. The company David now owned 70% of was just an operational shell. It held the payroll obligations. It held the immense risk. It held all the liabilities. But the proprietary routing software that made the company highly profitable, the massive long-term warehouse leases across 3 different states, and the entire multi-million-dollar fleet of delivery trucks, did not belong to the company David just acquired. They belonged to a completely separate, invisible limited liability company registered entirely in my mother's name. And the equipment lease agreement between my mother's company and David's new shell company had officially expired at exactly midnight the night before. The beauty of the trap was in its absolute simplicity. David had spent the last 2 years completely disengaged from the actual operations of the business. He only cared about the quarterly profit reports and maintaining his fake executive title. He never bothered to read the vendor contracts or the equipment leases. If he had, he would have noticed that the company he just fought to control did not actually own a single truck. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to steal a company that was entirely dependent on a vendor it could no longer afford. And the owner of that vendor was sitting right next to me, driving the speed limit with her hands perfectly positioned at 10 and 2. He thought he had stolen an empire. In reality, he had just demanded the captain's chair on a rapidly sinking ship. Miles away, completely ignorant of the financial avalanche, heading directly their way, David and Patricia were pulling up to the wrought iron gates of the $1.5 million suburban estate. David punched the security code into the keypad with a triumphant flourish. The heavy metal gates swung open, welcoming the new master of the house. Brittany sat in the passenger seat, already browsing luxury furniture catalogs on her phone, calculating exactly how fast she could replace all my belongings. Patricia rode in the back, sipping the last of her lobby champagne, loudly praising her son for finally acting like a ruthless businessman. They drove up the long, winding driveway, admiring the perfectly manicured landscaping and the massive oak doors of the property they had just legally stolen. David parked in front of the grand entrance, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. He looked up at the towering brick facade like a king surveying his newly conquered kingdom. They walked through the front doors, their laughter echoing in the grand foyer. David immediately began talking about throwing a massive victory party, inviting all his investors to show off his new status as the sole owner. Patricia was already criticizing the entryway chandelier, demanding Brittany hire a decorator to erase any trace of my existence from the property. They walked through the expensive halls, touching the custom fixtures, reveling in their stolen victory. They were so blinded by their own greed and overwhelming arrogance that they failed to realize they had just walked willingly into a trap from which there was absolutely no financial escape. David had no idea that beneath the perfectly cut grass of his new front lawn, beneath the expensive hardwood floors, and the custom nursery he planned to use for his mistress, A ticking time bomb was waiting. He had not read the attachments. He had not looked at the property history. He had simply signed his name, eager to claim his prize, entirely unaware that the nightmare attached to his new wealth had just been activated. 2 hours after the court adjourned, I pulled my mother's sedan back up the long, winding driveway of the estate. The court order had granted me a strict 90-minute window to pack my personal clothing and a few sentimental items. A court-appointed monitor, a bored-looking man named Officer Jenkins, was parked by the curb in his official vehicle to ensure I did not take anything that legally belonged to David now. I stepped out into the biting winter wind, looking up at the towering brick facade. I had paid for every single brick of that house with years of missed sleep and grueling shifts. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a massive, looming monument to my own misplaced trust. I walked through the heavy front doors with my canvas duffel bag slung over my right shoulder. Officer Jenkins followed exactly 2 steps behind me, his boots clicking loudly on the marble floor of the foyer. The moment I crossed the threshold, the sound of obnoxious, high-pitched laughter echoed from the main living room. I braced myself, tightening my grip on the strap of my bag, and walked toward the sound. The living room was a beautiful space I had designed with painstaking care over the course of 3 years. I had chosen the warm cream paint on the walls, the plush velvet sofas, and the heavy oak bookshelves that lined the back of the room. Now it was completely overrun by the 2 women who had happily dismantled my marriage. Brittany was standing on a metal step stool near the massive bay windows, holding a bright pink measuring tape against the expensive glass. She was talking loudly to a decorator on speakerphone, complaining about the terrible outdated lighting in the room and demanding completely new fixtures. Patricia was lounging on my favorite velvet sofa, her designer shoes resting right on the delicate silk cushions. She held a fresh glass of champagne, looking entirely too pleased with herself. When they heard my footsteps on the hardwood floor, Brittany turned around. She did not look embarrassed to be caught measuring my house. She looked absolutely thrilled. "Oh, good you are here," Brittany said, hopping down from the step stool with a bounce in her step. "I need to know if these custom curtains can be ripped out easily, or if I have to hire a contractor to drill the brackets out of the wall. I am going for a modern, minimalist vibe, and all this heavy, depressing fabric is just suffocating my creative energy." I ignored her completely. I kept my face blank, walked past them, and headed straight for the hallway leading to the master bedroom to pack my clothes. But Patricia was not going to let me leave quietly. She stood up from the sofa, intentionally stepping into the hallway to block my path. "Do not ignore the new lady of the house, Julia." Patricia scolded, her voice dripping with fake aristocratic authority. "Brittany is just trying to fix the absolute disaster you made of this place. You always had the design taste of a truck stop waitress. We are just thankful David finally found someone with a little bit of class to elevate his lifestyle to where it should be." I looked at Patricia, keeping my expression completely neutral. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing my anger. I simply asked her to move out of my way so I could pack my things and leave the premises. Patricia scoffed loudly, but she stepped aside, whispering a cruel insult under her breath as I walked past her. I spent the next 45 minutes in the master bedroom, throwing my business suits, my shoes, and my toiletries into the duffel bag. Every corner of the room was a painful reminder of David. His cologne still lingered heavily in the air. His expensive watches sat perfectly aligned on the mahogany dresser. I felt a brief wave of nausea, but I forced it down. The countdown had already started. They had no idea what was coming for them. When I finally zipped up the heavy duffel bag, I walked back out to the living room to grab the one item I truly cared about. It was sitting on a sturdy accent table near the stone fireplace. It was an antique ceramic vase painted with intricate blue and white floral patterns. It was not worth millions of dollars. It was not a famous designer brand. But it was the only physical heirloom my late grandmother had left me before she passed away. My grandmother had raised me when my mother was working 3 jobs just to keep us fed. She had taught me the absolute value of hard work, of staying humble, and of never letting anyone walk all over me. That vase was the only connection I had left to her memory. As I walked toward the fireplace to retrieve it, Brittany noticed exactly where my eyes were focused. A malicious, playful glint sparked in her young eyes. She grabbed a heavy fabric swatchbook from the coffee table and pretended to examine the wall color right next to my grandmother's vase. I quickened my pace, my heart suddenly hammering painfully against my ribs. "Brittany, step away from that table," I said, my voice hardening with genuine warning. Brittany turned to look at me, feigning complete innocence. "Oh, this old thing," she asked, placing her hand directly on the rim of the delicate ceramic. "It is so incredibly ugly. I was just telling Patricia that it looks like something you would find at a cheap garage sale. It completely ruins the modern aesthetic I am trying to build here. Do not touch it," I warned again, closing the distance between us as fast as I could. "Oops," Brittany said. Her voice was entirely flat and devoid of any real surprise or remorse. She flicked her wrist. She deliberately pushed the heavy fabric swatchbook right into the side of the antique vase. I lunged forward, stretching my arms out desperately to catch it, but I was too late. The ceramic hit the solid hardwood floor with a deafening crash. The sound of the shattering clay ripped straight through my heart. The vase exploded into dozens of jagged pieces, scattering violently across the polished wood. The beautiful blue and white patterns my grandmother had loved so much were completely destroyed in a single second. I dropped to my knees, staring at the ruined shards. My breath caught in my throat, a thick, suffocating knot of pure grief forming in my chest. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy," Brittany said, putting a hand over her mouth in a mock display of shock. "But honestly, I did you a massive favor. It was way too tacky for a luxury house like this anyway. You can probably buy a new one at a discount store for $10. I looked up, my vision blurring with hot, stinging tears. Patricia was standing right behind Brittany, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was smiling broadly, her eyes gleaming with wicked, triumphant satisfaction. She was daring me to react. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to lunge at Brittany and hurt her. She wanted me to lose my temper in front of Officer Jenkins, who had just stepped into the living room after hearing the loud crash. If I attacked them, I would immediately violate the court order. I would be arrested for assault right there in my own living room, and David would have all the proof he needed to show the family judge that I was an unstable, violent woman who should not have custody of her children. It was a calculated, vicious trap designed to break me completely. I closed my eyes and took a long, shuddering breath. I thought about my mother waiting in the car outside. I thought about the massive environmental fine currently speeding its way toward David's new shell company. I thought about the total absolute destruction I had already set in motion with my lawyer. The fiery anger inside me solidified into a wall of solid, unbreakable ice. I opened my eyes. I did not yell. I did not cry. I stood up slowly, walked right past a grinning Brittany, and went straight to the utility closet in the hallway. I pulled out a wooden broom and a small plastic dustpan. I walked back into the living room and knelt down on the hardwood floor. In complete, terrifying silence, I began to sweep up the broken pieces of my grandmother's legacy. The scraping sound of the broom bristles against the wood was the only noise in the room. I carefully gathered every single shard, treating the broken pieces with the utmost respect, and gently slid them into the side pocket of my duffel bag. I would glue it back together later. I would fix it just like I was going to fix my life. Patricia let out a loud, mocking sigh. "Well, look at that," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "She is finally cleaning up after herself. It is good to see you finally know your proper place, Julia. You always were better suited for sweeping floors than running a corporate business." I zipped my duffel bag shut and stood up. I looked directly at Patricia, and then I looked at Brittany. I did not look defeated. I smiled. It was a dead, hollow smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of a woman who knew she was leaving a burning building and had quietly locked all the doors from the outside. "Enjoy the house, ladies," I said, my voice perfectly calm and smooth. "I really hope it brings you everything you truly deserve." Patricia frowned, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of an emotional breakdown. Brittany just rolled her eyes and went back to looking at her thick fabric swatches. I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand entryway, eager to leave the toxic atmosphere of that house behind me forever. As I reached out to grab the brass handle of the heavy front door, the wood swung inward violently, nearly hitting me in the face. David stood in the doorway, blocking my exit. He looked flushed and arrogant, having just returned from meeting with his lawyers to finalize the paperwork transfer. He stepped into the foyer, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe, ensuring I could not get past him to reach the safety of the driveway. "Not so fast," Julia David said, holding out his hand with a demanding, expectant look. "You forgot something at the courthouse. I want the master passwords to the company servers right now. And hand over the physical keys to the logistics fleet. You do not get to leave this property until I have absolute total control of my new company." Instead of fighting, I simply shifted the weight of my heavy canvas duffel bag higher on my shoulder. I did not blink. I did not let a single ounce of emotion cross my face. I reached into the front zipper pocket of my bag and pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive. I placed it gently right into the center of his waiting palm. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single heavy brass key attached to a faded black lanyard. It was the master key to the main dispatch terminal. I dropped it into his hand right on top of the flash drive. David actually laughed out loud. He closed his fist around the drive and the key, holding them up like a hard-won trophy. He leaned in close, his breath washing over my face, smelling of the champagne he had been drinking with his mother and his mistress. He told me that this was the exact moment I became nobody. He said I was walking out of a $1 million estate to go live in a cramped, miserable apartment, while he took over an empire that was finally free of my suffocating, small-minded management. He gloated that by tomorrow morning, he would have my name completely scrubbed from every single server, every legal document, and every bank account attached to the corporation. He promised me that within a month the industry would completely forget I ever existed. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I sincerely hoped he knew how to drive a commercial truck because he was going to need to learn very quickly. David scoffed, entirely missing the warning buried in my words. He stepped aside, gesturing grandly toward the driveway, telling me to get off his property before he called the police and had me arrested for trespassing. I walked down the sweeping concrete steps of the front porch, the cold winter air biting at my cheeks, and climbed into the passenger seat of my mother's unassuming sedan. The court-appointed monitor returned to his cruiser, his job officially complete. My mother did not ask me if I was okay. She did not offer empty platitudes. She just put the car in drive and pulled away from the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. As we drove down the tree-lined suburban street, leaving David and his mistress behind to celebrate their stolen victory, a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settled deep into my bones. The illusion was perfectly executed. David thought he had just ruthlessly conquered my entire life. He thought the 70% stake he had wrestled away in family court made him a powerful logistics magnate. He believed he had stolen my life's work for pennies on the dollar. What David completely failed to realize, because he had spent the last 5 years playing golf, taking lavish corporate retreats, and pursuing 24-year-old mistresses, instead of actually reading our corporate financial statements, was that he had just fought a brutal legal war to take control of an empty, highly dangerous shell. The logistics and supply chain company that David now proudly owned was nothing more than a structural facade. Years ago, when the business first started bringing in serious multi-million-dollar revenue, my corporate attorney Richard advised me to compartmentalize our assets to protect us from volatile industry risks. The company David just seized held only the operational liabilities. It held the massive payroll obligations for hundreds of employees. It held the expensive worker compensation insurance policies. It held the risky short-term vendor contracts and the day-to-day debt required to keep the lights on. The actual tangible value of the empire was securely locked away in a completely separate, entirely invisible entity. The highly advanced proprietary routing software that saved our clients millions of dollars in shipping delays did not belong to David's company. The massive, lucrative long-term leases on 5 different commercial warehouses across the Midwest did not belong to David's company. And the actual physical fleet of 80 heavy-duty delivery trucks, the literal engine of the entire business, absolutely did not belong to David's company. Every single one of those invaluable assets was legally registered to a private, independent, limited liability corporation. And the sole uncontested owner of that corporation was the quiet woman currently driving me down the interstate. My mother Martha owned every piece of equipment David needed to keep his new empire afloat. For years, David's company had been legally leasing the trucks, the software, and the warehouse space from my mother's corporation. It was a standard airtight corporate equipment lease, buried deep in the hundreds of pages of legal operating documents that David always deemed too boring to review. He only ever cared about the summary page showing our profit margins so he could figure out how much of a bonus he could pull for himself. He never cared to understand the complex, brilliant architecture of how those profits were actually generated. That arrogance and profound ignorance was his ultimate fatal flaw. The equipment lease agreement between my mother's private corporation and the shell company David now owned had a very specific non-negotiable expiration date. Because my attorney Richard had meticulously planned this transition months in advance, he had ensured the timing would align perfectly with the divorce settlement. The lease officially expired at exactly midnight the night before the court hearing. Because David had aggressively forced me to resign from all executive positions and surrender my shares under the threat of blackmail. There was no authorized officer left in his company who had the legal standing or the knowledge to renew that equipment contract. David had no idea the lease even existed, let alone that it had just terminated. He was now the proud majority owner of a logistics company that did not legally have the right to operate a single delivery truck, utilize a single warehouse, or access a single piece of routing software. His entire multi-million-dollar operation was instantly completely paralyzed, and he was currently sitting in my former living room drinking champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that his company was rapidly bleeding to death. The very next morning, David drove his luxury sport utility vehicle to the downtown corporate headquarters. He parked in the reserved executive spot, rode the private elevator up to the top floor, and confidently strode into the massive corner office that used to be mine. He ignored the terrified, confused looks from the administrative staff who knew he had no idea how to actually run the floor. He threw his expensive Italian wool coat over the leather sofa and sat down in the high-backed executive chair behind the polished mahogany desk. He swiveled back and forth, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline below. He was on top of the world. He had the mansion. He had the beautiful young mistress. He had the incredibly lucrative business. He poured himself a cup of premium coffee, waiting for the inevitable flood of congratulatory phone calls from major clients and industry partners, eager to bow down to the new sole king of the supply chain. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy black phone on his mahogany desk began to ring. David smiled a wide, predatory smile. He leaned forward, adjusted his silk tie, and picked up the receiver, expecting to hear a wealthy investor ready to praise his brilliant corporate takeover. He answered the phone with a smooth, practiced greeting, fully ready to assert his new dominance. But the voice on the other end of the line did not belong to a wealthy client. It did not belong to an eager investor or a congratulatory partner. The voice was flat, bureaucratic, and completely devoid of warmth. It was a senior field agent calling from the Environmental Protection Agency. "Am I speaking with David, the legally registered and current sole proprietor of the residential estate located at Oakwood Drive?" the man asked. David frowned slightly, his thick eyebrows knitting together in confusion. The mention of his home address instead of his corporate title threw him off balance. He sat up straighter, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Yes, this is David. I am the sole owner of the property. I literally just finalized the deed transfer yesterday afternoon in family court. Who is calling?" "My name is Agent Kenneth Miller." The man stated, his tone clipped and entirely humorless. "I am calling from the Regional Enforcement Division of the Environmental Protection Agency. We have an active Class 1 environmental emergency linked directly to the exact coordinates of your property, and as the current legal deed holder, you have been identified as the primary responsible party." David let out a short, dismissive laugh. He immediately assumed this was some sort of minor bureaucratic mix-up. Perhaps a landscaping permit issue, a neighborhood zoning violation regarding the height of the privacy fences, or some ridiculous suburban homeowner association complaint that had somehow been escalated. He leaned back in his chair again, crossing his expensive Italian leather shoes over his knees. "Listen, Agent Miller," David said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think you have the wrong guy, or at least the wrong level of severity here. I live in a $1.5 million luxury residential estate. It is a pristine, high-end suburban neighborhood. We do not have environmental emergencies. If my landscaping crew accidentally used the wrong fertilizer on the front lawn, just mail a standard citation to my office, and my accounting department will cut you a check for the $50 fine by Friday. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Agent Miller finally spoke, his voice dropped an octave, radiating a terrifying, icy professionalism that made the hairs on the back of David's neck stand straight up. This is not a landscaping citation, David, and this is not a negotiation. I need you to listen to me very carefully because you are currently facing federal criminal negligence charges. David stopped breathing. The smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from his face. He uncrossed his legs and planted his feet firmly on the carpet, his heart suddenly accelerating. According to historical municipal zoning records, Agent Miller continued reading from what sounded like a thick physical file. The land beneath your current residential estate was not always zoned for luxury housing. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, that specific plot of land operated as an independent commercial gas station and automotive repair facility. When the business went bankrupt and the land was eventually sold and rezoned for residential development, the previous owners committed a severe violation of federal environmental protocol. They did not excavate and remove the underground commercial fuel storage tanks. They simply paved over them and built the foundation of your house right on top of a dormant toxic hazard. David swallowed hard. His mouth was suddenly incredibly dry. Okay, he stammered, his confident executive persona fracturing instantly. But that was decades ago. I had nothing to do with that. I just moved into the house. Those underground steel storage tanks have been quietly rusting and deteriorating beneath your property for nearly 40 years, Agent Miller said, completely ignoring David's protests. Early this morning, our municipal water monitoring stations detected a massive catastrophic spike in toxic chemical levels. One of those massive underground tanks has completely ruptured. Thousands of gallons of degraded, highly toxic petroleum hydrocarbons and benzene are currently actively leaking directly into the municipal groundwater supply. You are poisoning the drinking water of an entire affluent suburban district. David felt the blood drain entirely from his face. The luxurious, climate-controlled corner office suddenly felt as though it was suffocating him. He stood up from his mahogany desk, his hands shaking slightly as he pressed the phone tighter against his ear. He paced over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling city skyline, but he was no longer seeing the view. He was seeing his entire stolen empire crumbling before it had even taken its first breath. "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former arrogance. "What do you expect me to do about a ruptured gas tank buried under my foundation?" The Environmental Protection Agency is issuing an immediate non-negotiable mandate for comprehensive soil remediation and chemical cleanup, Agent Miller informed him. A specialized hazardous materials containment crew is already being dispatched to your neighborhood to secure the municipal water table. They will have to bring heavy industrial excavation equipment onto your property. They are going to tear up your manicured lawns, destroy your driveway, and drill deep beneath the foundation of your luxury home to extract the ruptured tanks and remove hundreds of tons of contaminated, highly toxic soil. David gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned completely white. "You cannot just tear up my property. I will not allow it. I will call my lawyers. I will file an injunction." "You do not have a choice," Agent Miller countered sharply. "This is a federal public health mandate. If you attempt to block the containment crews, you will be arrested on site for endangering public welfare. But the immediate destruction of your property is actually the least of your concerns right now. As the current legally registered owner of the estate, the federal government holds you strictly, jointly, and severally liable for the entire cost of the emergency containment and the ongoing environmental remediation." David felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He loosened his expensive silk tie, suddenly feeling as though he could not get enough oxygen into his lungs. "How much?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How much is the cleanup going to cost?" The preliminary estimate for the initial emergency groundwater containment, the industrial excavation of the ruptured commercial tanks, And the mandated hazardous soil replacement is a staggering $800,000, Agent Miller stated. And that is just the baseline cost. If the toxic plume spreads any further into the neighboring properties before we can contain it, that number will easily double. $800,000. The number echoed in David's mind like a physical blow to the head. It was nearly $1 million in toxic debt dropped right into his lap, less than 24 hours after he thought he had won the ultimate victory. I do not have $800,000 in liquid cash just sitting around, David yelled, panic completely taking over his rational mind. This is insane. I am not paying for a gas station I never owned. This is not my fault. My ex-wife bought that land. Julia bought that property 10 years ago. She is the one who built the house. She is the one who failed to do a proper historical land survey. Go after her. Send the $800,000 bill to her. Agent Miller let out a heavy, tired sigh, the sound of a man who had dealt with desperate, cornered people 1,000 times before. It does not matter who originally bought the land, David. Under current environmental law, liability belongs exclusively to the person whose name is currently on the deed at the time the hazard is discovered. We pulled the county court records this morning. You aggressively demanded sole ownership of the property in your divorce settlement. You waived the standard 30-day property inspection period to expedite the transfer. You signed the legal documents taking the estate completely as is. The liability transferred entirely to you the second the judge struck his gavel. Your ex-wife is completely legally immune. You are the sole responsible party. The trap. The realization hit David with the force of a runaway freight train. He remembered the courtroom. He remembered the way Julia had hesitated, her hands shaking before her mother whispered in her ear. He remembered Julia suddenly looking perfectly calm, signing the documents without another word of protest. He remembered Patricia laughing in the gallery, bragging about rushing the paperwork to kick Julia out of the house. He remembered the very last page of the settlement agreement, the one he had been too arrogant and impatient to actually read before signing his name. The $800,000 invoice will be delivered to your corporate headquarters by certified mail this afternoon, Agent Miller concluded. It is payable immediately upon receipt. If the funds are not secured within 48 hours, the federal government will place massive liens on every single asset you own. We will freeze your corporate bank accounts, and we will pursue federal criminal charges for negligence. Have a good day, David. The line went completely dead. David stood paralyzed in the middle of his massive executive office, the dial tone buzzing loudly in his ear. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the plush carpet with a dull thud. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He was drowning. He had thought he was a brilliant, ruthless businessman, taking over a lucrative empire. In reality, he had been lured into a carefully constructed, meticulously planned financial slaughterhouse. Julia had known. She had to have known about the toxic hazard buried beneath the house. She had deliberately handed him a poisoned chalice, wrapped it in a shiny bow, and let his own blinding greed do all the work. A wave of absolute, uncontrollable rage washed over the paralyzing panic. David kicked his heavy leather executive chair, sending it crashing into the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was not going to let her win. He was not going to let a blue-collar truck driver outsmart him and bankrupt him in a single day. He stormed out of his corner office, completely ignoring his confused administrative staff who were staring at his disheveled, frantic appearance. He did not grab his expensive Italian coat. He did not say a word to anyone. He practically ran to the private elevator, mashing the button for the parking garage. He jumped into his luxury sport utility vehicle, the tires squealing violently against the concrete as he sped out into the downtown traffic. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, his eyes wide and manic as he recklessly swerved through the crowded city streets. He was driving straight toward Julia's newly established corporate office. He was going to burst through her doors, demand she face him, and force her to pay the bill that was about to destroy his life. David did not bother to park his luxury sport utility vehicle in a designated visitor space. He abandoned it right in the middle of the circular drop-off lane in front of the towering glass and steel building that housed my newly established corporate headquarters. He left the engine running and the keys in the ignition, completely uncaring if the vehicle was towed. His mind was entirely consumed by a blinding, white-hot panic. He stormed through the automated sliding glass doors of the main lobby, his heavy leather shoes striking the polished granite floor with violent, aggressive force. The receptionist, a sharply dressed young woman sitting behind a sleek marble desk, immediately stood up and asked if he had an appointment. David completely ignored her. He pushed past the security turnstiles, relying on the sheer brute force of his momentum to carry him through the expansive, brilliantly lit corridors of my new operational hub. He had expected me to be working out of some cramped, depressing little rental office on the bad side of town. Instead, he found himself running through a multi-million-dollar corporate facility, surrounded by dozens of focused employees, managing the very logistics fleet he thought he had stolen just 24 hours ago. He found my corner office at the end of the main executive hallway. The heavy glass door was slightly ajar, and he shoved it open so violently that the metal handle slammed against the drywall, leaving a deep visible dent. I was sitting comfortably behind a custom-crafted walnut desk, reviewing a series of architectural blueprints for a massive new warehouse expansion project. A cup of freshly brewed espresso sat steaming to my right. I did not jump when the door slammed. I did not flinch. I slowly set down my silver pen, folded my hands neatly on top of the blueprints, and looked up at the man who had spent the last decade taking credit for my absolute exhaustion. David looked completely unhinged. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his neck. The top button of his tailored dress shirt was torn open. His face was unnaturally flushed, and dark patches of sweat had already soaked through the underarms of his suit jacket. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted for several miles. "You set me up!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unrestrained hysteria. He marched right up to my desk and slammed his open palms down on the polished wood. "You absolute sociopath. You set me up." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. I placed the ceramic cup back onto its matching saucer, making sure not to spill a single drop. "You are going to have to be a bit more specific, David," I said, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotional reaction. "You have stolen quite a lot from me this week. You will need to narrow down exactly which theft you are currently complaining about." "The Environmental Protection Agency just called me," he roared, his eyes wide and frantic. "They told me about the underground storage tanks. They told me about the commercial gas station that used to be on the property. They said one of the tanks ruptured and is actively leaking toxic petroleum and benzene into the local municipal groundwater supply. They are sending a federal hazardous materials containment crew to tear up my front lawn and drill through my foundation today." I raised a single eyebrow, offering him a look of mild, detached curiosity. "That sounds like a terrible inconvenience for your landscaping. I hope Brittany does not get dust on her new curtains." "Do not play games with me, Julia," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "The federal agent said the emergency soil remediation and the commercial hazard cleanup is going to cost $800,000. $800,000. And because my name is currently on the property deed, the federal government is holding me strictly and legally liable for the entire bill. They are threatening to freeze all my corporate assets and press federal criminal charges if I do not secure the funding within 48 hours. I simply nodded, maintaining direct eye contact. Federal environmental regulations are incredibly strict regarding groundwater contamination. You really should have read up on local municipal zoning history before demanding the keys to the kingdom. "I am not paying a single dime of that money," David sneered, pounding his fist on the desk again. "You are the one who bought that toxic plot of dirt 10 years ago. You are the one who built the house on top of a dormant hazard. You are legally responsible for this disaster, and you are going to write a check to the federal government right now to clear my name. I will drag you back into family court. I will sue you for real estate fraud. I will tell the judge that you intentionally hid a massive environmental defect during the asset division process." I watched him unravel, letting his desperate, hollow threats wash over me like a gentle breeze. When he finally ran out of breath and stopped screaming, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I slowly opened the top drawer of my walnut desk. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, cream-colored legal folder. It was the exact same stack of divorce settlement papers we had both signed in the downtown Chicago courtroom just yesterday afternoon. The blue ink of our signatures was practically still fresh. I placed the heavy document squarely in the center of the desk, right between his sweating hands. "I am not writing a check for anything, David," I said, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "And you are not taking me back to family court. You are going to pay the Environmental Protection Agency every single penny of that $800,000, and you are going to do it with a smile on your face." David scoffed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You are out of your mind. No judge in the country would hold me responsible for a hidden defect you failed to disclose." I reached out and flipped open the thick settlement packet. I bypassed the pages regarding the company shares. I bypassed the pages detailing the custody arrangements. I turned directly to the very last page of the binding legal agreement. It was the page containing Schedule B, the specific terms and conditions governing the transfer of the residential estate. I spun the document around so it was facing him perfectly. I tapped my manicured index finger against a densely typed paragraph near the bottom of the page. "You really should have listened to your lawyers when they advised you to be patient," I said, allowing a slow, sweet, absolutely venomous smile to spread across my face. "Let me read this specific clause out loud for you, just in case your vision is blurring from the panic." I leaned forward, my voice crisp and clear, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "The grantee, which is you, David, agrees to assume full, unencumbered ownership of the residential property. The grantee formally acknowledges that the property is being transferred entirely, as is inclusive of all existing structural defects, outstanding municipal liens, and most importantly, all existing environmental liabilities, fines, and hazards." The remaining color completely drained from David's face. He stared down at the bold, unforgiving black text, his mouth hanging slightly open. His eyes darted back and forth across the legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. "Do you remember the discovery phase of our divorce negotiations last month?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle and mocking. "Do you remember when my corporate attorney formally requested the standard 30-day property inspection period prior to the transfer of the deed? It is a completely standard legal procedure to ensure neither party is saddled with hidden liabilities. An inspection would have mandated a deep soil survey. We would have found the rusting storage tanks. We would have discovered the toxic leak before the transfer was finalized." David swallowed hard, his throat working visibly as the terrifying realization began to settle into his bones. "But you did not want to wait 30 days, did you?" I continued, my smile widening. "More specifically, Patricia did not want to wait. Your mother stormed into that mediation room, threw her designer handbag on the table, and aggressively pressured your own legal team to completely waive the standard inspection period. Do you remember what she said to my lawyer? She said she wanted to waive the inspection because she wanted to, and I quote, kick the trash out of the house as fast as possible." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, basking in the absolute total destruction of the man standing in front of me. "Your mother was so eager to humiliate me, so desperate to let your young mistress start picking out new curtains for my living room, that she forced you to sign a blind liability waiver. You were so blinded by your own arrogance and your desperate need to look like a ruthless corporate conqueror that you eagerly signed your name on the dotted line. You willingly, legally, and permanently accepted nearly $1 million in toxic debt because you were too arrogant to read the fine print attached to your stolen prize." David looked physically ill. His hands were trembling so badly he had to grip the edges of my desk just to keep himself standing upright. The crushing, undeniable weight of his new reality was finally sinking in. He was legally trapped. The federal government was coming for him. He owed $800,000 immediately, and he had just seized control of a logistics company that did not actually own any delivery trucks to generate the cash he so desperately needed. He was completely, utterly bankrupt, and he had done it entirely to himself. But David was a true narcissist. Even when backed into a corner, even when staring directly at the irrefutable evidence of his own catastrophic failure, his massive, fragile ego simply refused to break. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted by the woman he had spent a decade treating like an uneducated servant. David leaned over my walnut desk, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. For a split second, I saw the absolute terror in his eyes. I saw the terrifying realization that he had just bankrupted himself. But David was a man built entirely on a foundation of fragile, toxic pride. Admitting defeat to me was a psychological impossibility for him. Instead of breaking down, the corners of his mouth twitched. The vicious sneer that had twisted his features suddenly broke open into a loud, booming laugh. It was a forced, manic sound that echoed harshly against the glass walls of my office. He pushed himself away from my desk, throwing his head back and laughing as if I had just told him the funniest joke in the world. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, smoothing it back into place, and began to pace across my office carpet like a predator that had just remembered its own strength. "You really think you have me beat?" David asked, his voice dripping with absolute unfiltered arrogance. "You really think a measly $800,000 fine is going to destroy me? You have spent too much time driving delivery trucks, Julia. Your mindset is entirely too small. You look at $1 million and you see a mountain. I look at $1 million and I see pocket change." I did not say a word. I simply watched him perform. "You think you are so brilliant?" David continued, gesturing wildly with his hands. "You think trapping me with a landscaping bill is some sort of masterstroke of corporate warfare. But you are completely forgetting who actually runs the logistics empire now. I do not need your little secret fleet of trucks. I do not need your warehouse leases. I am the majority owner of the corporation, and because of my industry connections, my company just secured the single largest contract in the history of the Midwest supply chain." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes gleaming with a manic, greedy light. "Omnicorp, Julia," he said, dragging out the name of the retail giant, like it was a sacred chant. "We officially secured the 5-year exclusive distribution contract with Omnicorp yesterday. Do you have any idea how much that contract is worth? It is a multi-million-dollar deal. They are the absolute largest retail conglomerate in the entire Midwest. They have hundreds of megastores, and my company is now their sole exclusive logistics provider. I orchestrated that deal. I made that happen while you were busy playing with your little spreadsheets. I kept my hands folded neatly on top of my blueprints. I knew all about the Omnicorp contract. I knew about it because I was the one who had spent the last 8 months whining and dining their executive board, proving our operational efficiency, and building a flawless supply network that met their rigorous standards. David had merely shown up to the final handshake dinner to take the credit. But I let him talk. I let him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. "The first quarter advance payment from Omnicorp hits my corporate account by the end of the week," David bragged, stepping closer to my desk again. "That advance alone is worth more than $3 million in pure liquid cash. So go ahead and let the federal government send their hazardous materials crew to my property. Let them tear up the front lawn. Let them dig through the dirt." Brittany was already complaining about the outdated landscaping anyway. "When the environmental crew is finished cleaning up the soil, I will just use a fraction of my Omnicorp advance to pay off the stupid fine. Then I will hire a luxury contractor to build a massive infinity pool right over the excavated dirt." He leaned forward again, planting his hands on my desk, his voice dropping to a cruel, mocking tone. "I am going to use the rest of that advance to fund a lavish, beautiful lifestyle with a woman who actually knows how to appreciate wealth. Brittany and I are going to travel the world. We are going to buy new cars. We are going to live like royalty. And I am going to do it all with the profits from the company you built. I am going to prove to the entire industry that I never needed your blue-collar business acumen. You were just a stepping stone, Julia. You were the hired help. I am the actual visionary." He stared at me, waiting for my reaction. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to realize that his massive new corporate contract had completely neutralized my environmental trap. He wanted to see the exact moment my spirit broke. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the delicate handle of my ceramic espresso cup. I lifted it to my lips and took a slow, methodical sip of the warm, bitter coffee. I swallowed, set the cup back down perfectly in the center of its saucer, and looked him dead in the eye. "Oh, is that your plan?" I asked, my voice as smooth and calm as a frozen lake. David frowned, his triumphant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. The complete lack of panic in my voice was clearly unsettling him, but his ego was too massive to allow him to show any weakness. That is exactly my plan, he snapped, crossing his arms over his chest. I am going to be the most powerful logistics chief executive officer in the state, and you are going to fade into absolute obscurity. I allowed a slow, sweet, incredibly dangerous smile to spread across my face. I tilted my head slightly, looking at him, as if he were a particularly slow child who had just proudly recited an incorrect mathematical equation. Well, I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. I guess I will see you at the Omnicorp rebranding gala tomorrow night. David froze. His arms remained crossed, but his posture instantly grew rigid. The mention of the highly exclusive corporate gala clearly caught him completely off guard. He and his mother Patricia had spent the last 3 weeks obsessively planning a massive, overly expensive party at a luxury downtown hotel to celebrate the new Omnicorp contract and to formally rebrand the company under his sole leadership. It was supposed to be his ultimate coming out party to the business elite. It was an invitation-only event, restricted strictly to high-level investors, corporate partners, and the executive board of Omnicorp. He had specifically and explicitly banned me from the guest list. What are you talking about? David asked, his voice suddenly losing its booming confidence. You are not invited to that gala. Security has strict orders to turn you away at the door. You are not getting anywhere near my celebration. I just kept smiling, holding his gaze with absolute unyielding intensity. I did not offer any further explanation. I did not defend myself. I just let the silence stretch out between us, allowing the ominous weight of my words to hang heavily in the air of my office. David stared at me, his eyes darting back and forth across my face, desperately trying to read my expression. He was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. He was trying to understand how a woman who had just been handed a monumental legal defeat could sit there looking so incredibly serene. For a moment, a flicker of genuine doubt crossed his features. He realized he might have missed something. He realized there might be another hidden trap. But David simply could not help himself. His narcissism was a terminal disease. His brain quickly overrode the warning signals assuring him that I was just a bitter, jealous ex-wife trying to rain on his parade. He convinced himself that I was making empty threats because I was completely powerless to stop his impending success. You are pathetic, Julia, David spat, turning his back on me and storming toward the heavy glass door of my office. You are just a sad, jealous woman who cannot handle the fact that I won. Show up to the gala if you want to humiliate yourself. I will personally watch hotel security drag you out into the street. He grabbed the metal handle of the door, ripping it open with unnecessary force. He stepped out into the busy corporate hallway, pausing for one last second to look back at me over his shoulder. Enjoy your little office, he sneered. It is the last thing you will ever own. He let the glass door slam shut behind him. I watched through the transparent wall of my office as he marched angrily down the corridor, aggressively shoving past two of my junior analysts who were carrying a stack of shipping reports. He stormed through the security turnstiles, marched across the granite lobby, and disappeared through the automated sliding doors out into the freezing city air. I was getting back into his luxury sport utility vehicle. He was driving back to his toxic, heavily fined, contaminated suburban estate. He was going home to pick out a tuxedo for the absolute biggest night of his entire professional career. He was going to spend the next 24 hours dreaming about millions of dollars and a lavish lifestyle, completely and blissfully unaware of the catastrophic ambush waiting for him in that hotel ballroom. I picked up my silver pen, pulled the architectural blueprints back to the center of my desk, and went right back to work. I had an empire to run, and I needed to pick out a very specific evening gown for tomorrow night. The trap had been set, the bait had been swallowed, and the execution was going to be absolutely flawless. The ballroom of the Grand Azure Hotel downtown was dripping with the kind of manufactured aggressive luxury that only desperate people use to prove their worth. David had rented out the entire top floor for his massive rebranding gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of elite corporate guests, industry investors, and supply chain executives. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. Ice sculptures shaped like delivery trucks melted slowly near the open bar. Banners bearing David's newly designed corporate logo hung from the ceiling. He had spared absolutely no expense for his coronation. It was a beautiful, spectacular display of a man eagerly spending millions of dollars he did not actually possess. Patricia was completely in her element. She strutted through the sea of expensive suits wearing a heavily beaded designer gown that shimmered under the ballroom lights. She held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and used the other to dramatically gesture as she held court among a group of wealthy investors. I did not have to be in the room yet to know exactly what she was saying, because my loyal former colleagues were already texting me her exact quotes. She was laughing loudly, telling anyone who would listen how her brilliant son had finally trimmed the dead weight from his life. She bragged about how David had single-handedly ousted his blue-collar, unsophisticated ex-wife to elevate the company to its true potential. Brittany was right there next to her, draped in silk, showing off the diamond tennis bracelet she had stolen from my 10 years of labor. David stood near the main stage wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, accepting handshakes and backslaps from men who thought they were looking at the Midwest's newest logistics king. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the man they were toasting was currently sitting on nearly $1 million of toxic environmental debt and owned an empty corporate shell. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open. For my entire professional career, I had prioritized function over form. I wore practical pantsuits, flat shoes for walking warehouse floors, and kept my hair tied back so it would not get caught in the wind while inspecting loading docks. David and Patricia had used that practicality to mock me to convince their high society friends that I was just a dirty truck driver who lacked the refinement necessary to run a real corporate empire. Tonight I was going to burn that false narrative straight to the ground. I stepped into the ballroom wearing an immaculate custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that hugged every curve and fell to the floor in a sweeping, elegant line. My hair was professionally styled, framing my face with soft waves, and I wore a simple but blindingly brilliant diamond necklace that I had purchased myself to celebrate my newfound freedom. I did not look like a truck stop waitress. I looked like a chief executive officer who owned the entire building. But my dress was not what caused the music to falter. It was not my jewelry that made the conversations nearest the door suddenly die out. It was the man walking beside me, his arm offered to me in a gesture of absolute unyielding respect. Harrison was the billionaire founder and CEO of Omnicorp. He was not just wealthy, he was a kingmaker in the commercial supply chain sector. A single nod of approval from him could secure a company's future for decades, and a frown could trigger an immediate catastrophic stock sell-off. David had spent the last 2 hours bragging about his exclusive partnership with Harrison's conglomerate, loudly telling his investors that Harrison was coming tonight to personally toast to their new 5-year contract. Harrison had indeed arrived, but he was not walking toward David. He was walking arm in arm with me. The ripple effect across the massive ballroom was instantaneous and breathtaking. As Harrison and I walked slowly down the center aisle, the loud chatter simply evaporated. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped, heads turned, jaws literally dropped. The executives and investors who had just been shaking David's hand now stared in absolute stunned silence as the most powerful man in the room proudly escorted the woman David had just publicly discarded. David froze near the open bar. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he might pass out. His eyes darted from me to Harrison and back to me again, his brain completely failing to process the visual information he was receiving. His arrogant posture collapsed, replaced by a sudden rigid terror. But Patricia did not have the business acumen to recognize the sheer danger of the situation. Her narcissism blinded her entirely to the hierarchy of the room. When she saw me walking through the crowd in a dress that easily cost more than her entire evening wardrobe, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed her champagne glass down onto a passing waiter's tray and marched directly toward us, her heels stabbing into the thick carpet. "What do you think you are doing?" Patricia screeched, her voice shrill and echoing loudly in the suddenly quiet ballroom. The remaining ambient noise died completely. Every single eye in the room was now locked on her. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. You have no right to show your face here after everything you tried to steal from my son. You are not on the guest list. This is a private, highly exclusive corporate celebration. Beggars are not allowed to just waltz into our events to try and steal a free meal. You are nothing but a glorified delivery driver. David finally snapped out of his shock and took a desperate step forward, his hands raised in a panic. Mom, wait, stop right now. But Patricia was completely out of control, riding the high of her own perceived authority. She turned her frantic, hateful gaze toward the massive security guards flanking the ballroom doors. Security. Guards, get over here right now. Remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is trespassing. Throw the trash out into the street where she belongs. Two burly hotel security guards took a hesitant step forward, unsure of how to proceed given the heavy tension in the room. They looked toward David for confirmation, but David was paralyzed, his eyes locked entirely on the billionaire standing right next to me. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He simply stopped walking, stood his ground, and leveled a look of such profound, crushing authority at Patricia that she physically stumbled backward. That will not be necessary, Harrison said, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. He raised one hand, a simple gesture of command, and the security guards immediately backed down, recognizing instantly who actually held the true power in this scenario. Patricia gasped, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. Mr. Harrison, you do not understand. This woman is a vindictive, bitter ex-wife. She is trying to ruin my son's night. She has no business being here with you. Harrison adjusted his jacket, his expression hardening into a mask of pure corporate ruthlessness. He looked at Patricia, as if she were a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of his very expensive shoe. He then turned his cold gaze toward David, who was currently sweating straight through his custom tuxedo. I am the one who invited Julia tonight, Harrison stated, projecting his voice so every investor partner and board member in the room could hear him perfectly. And considering Omnicorp funded the massive cash advance that was supposed to pay for this absurd self-congratulatory circus, I suggest you tell your mother to lower her voice before I have my personal security team escort her out of the building. David swallowed hard. He grabbed his mother by the arm, roughly pulling her back into the crowd. Mom, shut up, he hissed, genuine terror finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Harrison turned his attention away from them, offering me a polite, respectful nod. He gently released my arm and stepped past the frozen, terrified mother and son. He walked methodically up the short carpeted steps to the main stage, approaching the microphone stand that David had intended to use for his grand victory speech. Harrison leaned forward and tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, percussive thumps echoed like gunshots through the massive ballroom. Every executive, every shareholder, and every corporate spy in the room held their breath, completely fixated on the stage. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Harrison began, his tone sharp and strictly business. I know David invited you all here tonight to celebrate a new era for his logistics company. However, I have a major immediate announcement regarding the future of the Omnicorp distribution contract. The echo of Harrison's voice filled the massive ballroom, hanging heavy in the absolute silence that had overtaken the crowd. Every single investor, corporate partner, and board member stared intently at the stage, their expensive champagne glasses frozen in their hands. David stood paralyzed near the open bar. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The crystal glass he had been holding slipped from his sweaty fingers, hitting the polished marble floor with a sharp crack that made several people flinch. He did not even look down at the shattered pieces. His wide, terrified eyes were locked entirely on the billionaire standing at the microphone. Effective as of 5:00 this evening. Harrison continued, his voice projecting calm and devastating authority across the room. Omnicorp is completely and permanently severing all business ties with your organization. We have formally triggered the immediate cancellation of the regional distribution contract. A collective audible gasp rippled through the sea of high society guests. The investors who had just spent the last 2 hours shaking David's hand and toasting to his new empire immediately stepped back, physically distancing themselves from him as if his sudden failure was contagious. David felt his knees buckle slightly. He grabbed the edge of a tall cocktail table just to keep himself upright. His mind scrambled violently, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in the city. He abandoned his post by the bar and practically lunged toward the stage, pushing past a group of startled shareholders. "Mr. Harrison, wait!" David stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic as he looked up at the podium. "There must be a clerical error. My legal team just finalized the paperwork yesterday. We are fully prepared to begin regional routing by Monday morning. I am the majority owner now. I have absolute control of the board. We are ready to execute your supply chain exactly as planned." Harrison looked down at David from the stage. There was no anger in the billionaire's eyes. There was only the cold, clinical pity of a seasoned corporate veteran looking at a man who had completely destroyed himself out of pure ignorance. "There is no clerical error," David Harrison stated clearly, ensuring every single investor in the room could hear the exact reason for the termination. "You fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the business agreement you thought you were signing. You were so eager to seize control of the company checkbook that you completely failed to review the basic legal architecture of our contract." Harrison stepped away from the podium, slightly gesturing with his hand as he explained corporate law to David, as if he were speaking to a particularly slow and stubborn child. "Omnicorp does not hand out multi-million-dollar distribution deals blindly," Harrison explained to the captivated crowd. "We protect our investments. The contract your company signed contained a very standard, highly specific key person clause. We did not agree to partner with your hollow shell of a company. We agreed to partner exclusively with the logistical genius who spent the last 8 months in our boardrooms mapping out our entire regional distribution network. We partnered with the woman who actually built the supply chain you have been taking credit for." David shook his head frantically, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He gripped the edge of the stage, his knuckles turning white. "No, that is wrong," he pleaded, completely abandoning any sense of professional dignity. "I am the face of the company. I am the one who handles the client relations. She just ran the background spreadsheets." "She did not just run the spreadsheets," Harrison countered, his voice hardening with genuine disdain for David's staggering arrogance. "Julia designed the proprietary software that cuts our shipping delays by 40%. Julia personally negotiated the warehouse leases that make our rapid deployment possible. Julia commands the absolute loyalty of the hundreds of drivers and dispatchers who actually move the freight. You ousted the very architect of your own success simply to stroke your own fragile ego. You removed the only asset in your entire corporation that Omnicorp actually cared about." Harrison looked out over the crowd, addressing the room at large. "Since David decided to force Julia out of her executive position, the key person clause was officially violated," Harrison announced. "Therefore, the contract with his organization is legally void, effective immediately. Omnicorp will not trust our regional distribution to a man who does not even know how his own trucks operate." The silence in the ballroom shattered into 100 overlapping conversations. The wealthy investors and corporate sharks in the room instantly smelled blood in the water. The men and women who had been fawning over Patricia's designer gown just moments ago were now turning their backs on her entirely. Patricia stood frozen against the back wall, her face flushed with absolute mortification, desperately trying to hide behind a decorative floral arrangement, as the high society wives she had been bragging to began whispering behind their hands and pointing in her direction. Brittany, the young mistress, who had been parading around the ballroom showing off her stolen diamond tennis bracelet, suddenly looked at David with a mixture of profound disgust and realization. She recognized instantly that the endless fountain of wealth she thought she had secured was completely evaporating before her very eyes. She quietly backed out of the main crowd, heading straight for the hotel lobby exits, without saying a single word to the man she had supposedly loved. But Harrison was not finished delivering his final crushing blow. He stepped back up to the microphone and smiled warmly, a stark contrast to the coldness he had directed at David. However, Harrison continued, his voice rising effortlessly above the murmurs of the crowd. "Omnicorp is still deeply committed to expanding our Midwest operations. I am very proud to announce that as of this afternoon, my board of directors has officially entered into a new, significantly more lucrative, exclusive 10-year contract. We have signed directly with a newly formed, fully independent logistics firm. Harrison extended his arm, gesturing gracefully toward where I was standing in the center aisle, a firm owned and operated entirely by our trusted partner Julia, he declared. The ballroom erupted. The same corporate executives who had been ignoring me all night suddenly broke into loud, enthusiastic applause. It was a brutal display of how quickly loyalty shifted in the corporate world. They recognized immediately who the true powerhouse was. Several high-profile investors began walking straight toward me, eager to offer their congratulations, hand me their business cards, and get in on the ground floor of my new venture. I stood tall in my emerald green gown, offering a polite, gracious nod to the applauding crowd. I did not gloat. I did not look at Patricia hiding in the corner. I did not need to. The total validation of my life's work was happening right in front of the very people who had tried to convince me I was nothing but dirt. David was hyperventilating. He stumbled backward away from the stage, his hands gripping his chest, as if he were having a physical heart attack. The walls of the luxurious ballroom seemed to be closing in on him. He had lost his wife. He had lost his reputation. He had just publicly lost the massive corporate contract that was supposed to save him from the $800,000 toxic environmental fine looming over his head. The millions of dollars in cash advances he had been bragging about to his mother were completely gone. He was standing in a rented hotel ballroom that he suddenly had absolutely no way to pay for. He frantically pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He told himself he could still salvage this. He still had the local routes. He still had the company payroll. He could restructure the debt. He could find another investor. His massive ego simply refused to accept that he was entirely out of options. But before he could even dial a single number, a short, balding man in a rumpled suit came sprinting through the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. It was Greg, David's head accountant. Greg looked completely terrified, his face slick with nervous sweat, completely ignoring the formal dress code of the gala. He pushed aggressively through the crowd of departing, whispering investors frantically searching the room until his eyes locked onto David's pale, panicking face. Greg ran straight up to David, practically collapsing against him as he tried to catch his breath. He was clutching a thick, crumpled manila envelope tightly against his chest, as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "David, we have a massive problem," Greg gasped, his voice trembling with sheer panic. "I have been trying to call your cell phone for the last hour." David grabbed the accountant by the shoulders, shaking him slightly. "What is it, Greg?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Tell me you secured the emergency credit extension from the regional bank. Tell me we have the cash to cover the environmental fine until I can secure a new client." Greg shook his head violently, looking down at the heavy manila envelope in his hands. He looked as though he was about to cry right there in the middle of the luxury hotel. "It is not the bank, David," Greg stammered, pulling a thick stack of legal notices from the envelope with trembling fingers. "It is the fleet. I just got the official notification from the leasing corporation. We do not have the OmniCorp advance to cover the renewal fee, and the grace period just expired. They are executing a full immediate repossession." Greg thrust the crumpled manila envelope into David's hands with terrifying urgency. David ripped the heavy paper open, his fingers fumbling as he pulled out the thick stack of legal notices. The bold red stamp across the top page read, "Notice of immediate asset seizure." David's eyes frantically scanned the dense, unforgiving legal text, while the remaining high society guests in the ballroom murmured and pointed in his direction. Greg stood trembling, his voice cracking as he explained the catastrophic reality of their situation. The master equipment lease for their entire fleet of delivery trucks, the commercial forklifts, and even the server racks running the dispatch software had officially expired. The renewal fee was a massive seven-figure sum, a payment David had planned to easily cover using the multi-million-dollar cash advance from the OmniCorp contract. But with Harrison publicly terminating that exact contract just moments ago, David had absolutely zero cash flow. There was no safety net. There was no emergency capital. Without the OmniCorp advance, his corporate shell company was completely insolvent. David dropped the heavy legal papers onto the marble ballroom floor. He did not say a word to his accountant. He shoved past the whispering investors, abandoning his own lavish million-dollar party to desperately try to save his dying company. He sprinted through the hotel lobby, his custom tuxedo clinging to his sweating frame, completely consumed by blinding panic. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, the harsh winter sun had barely begun to rise over the industrial district. David drove his luxury sport utility vehicle recklessly through the empty city streets, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He had spent the entire night pacing his heavily fined estate, calling every regional bank, every shady private lender, and every wealthy investor he knew, begging for an emergency bridge loan. Every single one of them had hung up on him. Word of his very public, humiliating execution at the Grand Azure Hotel had spread through the corporate grapevine with terrifying speed. He was officially a toxic pariah in the business world, and nobody was willing to throw a life preserver to a drowning man who had tied his own heavy anchor. He pulled up to the main gates of his primary shipping yard, desperately hoping his drivers had already started their morning routes. If the trucks were on the road, the repossession agents could not take them. He planned to lock the massive metal gates, barricade the property, and force a lengthy legal standoff in civil court. But as he turned the final corner, his heart plummeted straight into his stomach. The massive chain-link gates of the shipping yard were thrown wide open. A fleet of heavy-duty commercial tow trucks idled in the lot, their amber lights flashing rhythmically against the gray morning sky. Dozens of private security contractors in tactical gear had completely locked down the perimeter, blocking the confused delivery drivers from accessing the loading docks. Massive flatbed trailers were already hauling away the expensive industrial forklifts. Workers were carrying out towering server racks from the main dispatch office, severing the technological nervous system of his entire logistics operation. David slammed his vehicle into park, leaving it running as he sprinted across the freezing asphalt. He screamed at the private security guards, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He demanded they drop the equipment immediately. He yelled that he was the majority owner of the corporation, that he had the legal right to stop this seizure, and that he would have them all arrested for corporate theft. The security guards simply ignored him, forming an impenetrable human wall in front of the loading docks, their faces entirely devoid of sympathy. A figure stepped out from the main dispatch office, calmly walking down the metal stairs toward the chaotic scene. David froze. It was not a corporate liquidator. It was not a bank representative. It was Martha. My quiet, unassuming mother stood in the middle of the freezing shipping yard, wearing a thick wool coat and holding a heavy metal clipboard. She looked entirely unfazed by the flashing amber lights, the rumbling diesel engines, and the screaming executives. She watched David hyperventilate, her expression perfectly composed and completely devoid of any pity. David marched right up to her, his face purple with absolute rage. He pointed a shaking finger at her face, screaming that she had absolutely no right to be on his commercial property. He reminded her that he owned 70% of the logistics company, that a family court judge had legally awarded him the business, and that her daughter had signed the divorce papers, handing over the entire empire. He threatened to call the police and have her thrown in federal prison for orchestrating a massive illegal corporate raid. Martha did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She slowly lifted the metal clipboard, pulled a thick stack of stapled documents from beneath the clip, and pressed them directly against David's chest. "Read the incorporation documents!" "David," my mother said, her voice steady and sharp as a razor, "you own 70% of a company that currently has 50 employees, zero revenue, and an $800,000 environmental fine attached to its home office. You do not own a single truck in this yard. You do not own the servers. You do not even own the chairs in the break room. I do." David stared down at the documents in his trembling hands. The state registration papers clearly showed the formation of an independent limited liability corporation. The sole registered agent and absolute owner was Martha. Attached to the registration was the equipment lease agreement, explicitly detailing how David's shell company rented every single asset from her corporation. The final page was the formal legally binding notice of termination due to non-payment. "I am legally repossessing my property," Martha stated, signaling for the tow truck drivers to begin moving the massive delivery vehicles out of the yard. You failed to pay the renewal fee. Your company is currently trespassing on my assets. My daughter spent a decade building this fleet, and I will not let a lazy, arrogant thief run it into the ground. David dropped the papers onto the wet asphalt, watching in absolute horror as a tow truck hooked up the primary dispatch server unit and hauled it away. His drivers, realizing they no longer had trucks to drive or a functional company to work for, began turning around and walking to their cars to go home. The massive, bustling shipping yard was being systematically dismantled right in front of his eyes. Within 30 minutes, the entire lot was completely empty. The lifeblood of his stolen empire was gone. His company was officially paralyzed, permanently grounded, and utterly worthless. David stood alone in the center of the vast, empty asphalt lot. The cold morning wind whipped around him, chilling him to the bone. He had nothing left. His wealthy investors had completely abandoned him. The Omnicorp contract was shredded into pieces. His mother was facing potential legal exposure for her own reckless actions at the gala, and the federal government was actively preparing to seize his personal bank accounts to cover the massive toxic cleanup bill. He was completely, irrevocably bankrupt. He stumbled back to his luxury vehicle, his hands shaking so violently he could barely put the car in gear. He needed a drink. He needed comfort. He needed to go back to the $1.5 million estate lock, the massive oak doors, and figure out how to survive the impending financial apocalypse. He drove back to the affluent suburban neighborhood in a total suffocating daze. The drive felt like a death march. He pulled up to the sprawling brick mansion, the very house he had fought so ruthlessly to steal just 48 hours ago. He punched the security code into the keypad, dragged himself through the grand entryway, and let the heavy front door slam shut behind him. The house was entirely silent. He called out for Brittany. He needed her to tell him he was still a brilliant businessman. He needed her to stroke his shattered ego and assure him they could somehow beat this. Brittany! He yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the empty foyer. Brittany, I need you down here right now. There was no answer. He dropped his keys onto the entry table and practically dragged himself up the sweeping, curved staircase. He walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the master suite, calling her name again. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors to the master bedroom, entirely desperate for any form of comfort. David stopped dead in his tracks. The breath was completely knocked out of his lungs. He stared at the room in absolute horrified disbelief. The master bedroom had been completely ransacked. The expensive silk sheets were stripped from the bed and thrown haphazardly across the floor. The massive walk-in closet, which had been full of Brittany's newly purchased designer clothing just yesterday, was entirely empty. The drawers of the mahogany dressers were pulled open, their contents dumped unceremoniously onto the carpet. David rushed to the corner of the room, his heart hammering against his ribs, and dropped to his knees in front of his hidden wall safe. The heavy steel door of the safe was swung wide open. It was completely empty. He fell back onto the floor, staring blankly at the ransacked room, completely unaware that his nightmare had not even reached its terrifying climax. David fell to his knees on the plush carpet of the master bedroom, his hands desperately clawing at the empty metal shelves of the hidden wall safe. He refused to believe what his own eyes were showing him. The $50,000 in emergency, cash reserves, crisp stacks of bills he had hidden away, specifically for a crisis, just like this one, were completely gone. The velvet display box that housed his prized $40,000 Rolex lay discarded and upside down near the baseboard. Brittany had not just packed her bags and left him. She had meticulously and ruthlessly robbed him blind. His breathing grew shallow and erratic as he noticed a small neon yellow square of paper stuck to the heavy steel door of the safe. He reached out with a trembling hand and peeled the post-it note from the metal. The hasty looping handwriting belonged unmistakably to his young mistress. The words, written in bright blue ink, felt like a physical knife twisting directly into his gut. The note read, "I guess you are the one going back to the gutter where you belong. Good luck with the toxic dirt." She had weaponized his own mother's vicious, arrogant insult against him. Brittany had been standing right there in the luxury ballroom at the gala. She had witnessed the Omnicorp contract evaporate in front of hundreds of people. She had recognized instantly that David was not a wealthy, powerful chief executive officer, but a bankrupt, desperate man, drowning in nearly $1 million of federal environmental debt. She had abandoned the sinking ship the very second she smelled smoke, taking his absolute last financial lifeline with her to fund her escape. Before David could even fully process the staggering magnitude of his mistress's betrayal, a loud, piercing shriek erupted from the ground floor of the estate. He heard his mother Patricia screaming at the top of her lungs in the grand entryway, her voice cracking with pure, unrestrained hysteria. David dragged his heavy, exhausted body up from the bedroom floor and stumbled frantically down the sweeping, curved staircase. When he reached the grand foyer, he found the massive oak front doors thrown wide open to the freezing winter wind. Three men wearing heavy-duty neon yellow high-visibility jackets and white hard hats were standing firmly on his front porch. One of the men was holding a thick metal clipboard, while another was actively applying thick strips of industrial warning tape across the glass panes of the front door. They were fastening a massive bright red sign to the beautiful wood. The bold, uncompromising black letters on the sign read, "Condemned due to hazardous material." Patricia was standing squarely in the doorway, waving her arms wildly and hysterically demanding that the men get off her property immediately. She threatened to call the police, claiming she was a respected member of the community, and they had absolutely no right to deface her home. The lead official did not raise his voice, but his tone was entirely uncompromising and completely devoid of sympathy. He informed them that because the $800,000 environmental emergency fine had not been paid or secured with the federal government, the property was now officially classified as an active, uncontained biohazard zone. The toxic plume from the ruptured underground gas tanks had escalated overnight, and the house was legally deemed entirely unsafe for human habitation. David stood frozen on the bottom step of the magnificent staircase. He tried to speak, tried to use his former executive charm to tell the official that he just needed a few days to secure a private bridge loan, but the words completely died in his dry throat. The official handed David a formal, legally binding eviction mandate and stated they had exactly 10 minutes to gather their immediate personal belongings and vacate the premises. If they refused to leave the toxic zone, local armed law enforcement was already standing by at the end of the long driveway to arrest them both for interfering with a federal environmental containment procedure. 10 minutes. That was all the time they were granted to pack up the remnants of a $1.5 million luxury estate. David and Patricia ran through the house in an absolute panic, frantically shoving whatever designer clothes, scattered jewelry, and small valuables they could find into heavy-duty garbage bags and cheap plastic suitcases. When the timer expired, they were aggressively escorted out of the front doors by two uniformed police officers. They stood on the cold concrete sidewalk in the biting winter wind, surrounded by their haphazardly packed garbage bags, shivering uncontrollably in their expensive tailored clothes. The wealthy, status-obsessed suburban neighbors Patricia had spent years trying to impress, were standing out on their manicured lawns, pointing, whispering, and taking photos with their cell phones as they watched the mighty Blackwell family fall. The humiliation was absolute, total, and entirely public. David dropped his heavy garbage bags onto the concrete, burying his face in his cold hands. I was completely and utterly destroyed. He had no company, no money, no mistress, and now he did not even have a roof over his head. He looked over at his mother, fully expecting her to finally break down, apologize for her arrogance, and admit total defeat. But Patricia was a woman fueled by pure, unadulterated delusion. Her toxic pride was a sickness that simply refused to die. She pulled her designer wool coat tightly around her trembling shoulders, glaring viciously at the gossiping neighbors, before turning to David with a look of desperate, manic determination. "Do not stand there looking so pathetic," David, Patricia hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him closer so the observing police officers could not hear their conversation. "We are not going to end up sleeping in some filthy, disgusting homeless shelter. I am entirely too smart and too sophisticated to let that happen to us." David looked at her with hollow, bloodshot, defeated eyes. "We have absolutely nothing left, Mom." The corporate bank accounts are going to be permanently frozen by the federal government tomorrow morning. We are bankrupt. Patricia smiled a tight, conspiratorial, and entirely unhinged smile. She looked around nervously before dropping her voice to a rapid, urgent whisper. I did not tell you this because I wanted it to be a massive surprise for your birthday next month, but I have a brilliant backup plan. I knew that wretched, ungrateful ex-wife of yours was likely hiding money during the divorce negotiations. So a month ago, I took the initiative to secure our family's future. I secured a massive private commercial loan to purchase a gorgeous $2 million vacation home down in Florida. It is entirely in my name. The deed is completely clear of all this environmental garbage and the weather is beautiful. David stared at his mother, a tiny, fragile spark of desperate hope suddenly igniting in his crushed chest. A $2 million house in Florida. Yes, Patricia confirmed, her eyes gleaming with arrogant, delusional triumph. A massive, beautiful estate right on the water. We are going to take whatever cash we have left in our wallets, get on a commercial plane tonight, and flee to Florida. We will lay low, live off the equity of that massive house, and let the federal government try to squeeze blood from the toxic stone you left behind here in Chicago. Julia thinks she won the war, but she has absolutely no idea what I am truly capable of. While Patricia and David were standing on a freezing sidewalk plotting their great southern escape, I was sitting perfectly comfortably in my warm, expansive corner office, reviewing the latest highly lucrative profit margins for my newly secured Omnicorp contract. The transition of the supply chain routes had been absolutely seamless, and the commercial revenue was already flooding into my legitimate independent corporation. My desk phone rang, breaking my intense concentration. The caller identification showed it was Richard, my corporate attorney. I answered the call, leaning back into my plush leather executive chair. Tell me the environmental crew officially locked down the estate, I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. They did much better than that, Richard replied, a distinct note of deep professional satisfaction resonating in his voice. The property is officially condemned and locked down by the federal government. David and his mother are currently sitting on the neighborhood curb, surrounded by plastic garbage bags. But that is not why I am calling you right now, Julia. Our forensic accountants just flagged a massive, highly suspicious financial anomaly in the corporate ledgers. I sat up straighter, my focus instantly sharpening, placing my silver pen down on the desk. What kind of financial anomaly? Richard pulled up the secure file on his end of the line. Patricia has always been reckless and entitled, but she just enthusiastically handed us the final heavy nail for their legal coffin. A month ago, right before the divorce settlement was officially finalized in court, she initiated a massive unauthorized movement of commercial capital. She took out a $2 million private loan to purchase a luxury waterfront property in Florida. I frowned quickly, doing the mental math. Patricia has never worked a day in her life. She does not have the personal credit score or the collateral to secure a $2 million loan on her own. How exactly did she get the funding approved? That is the truly brilliant, catastrophically stupid part, Richard said, his voice dropping to a serious, lethal tone. She did not use her own personal credit. She used yours. She somehow bypassed the primary security protocols and illegally leveraged the existing commercial credit line of your former joint company to secure the loan. She essentially stole $2 million of active marital assets to buy herself a secret luxury vacation home. A cold, dangerous, and incredibly satisfying calm washed over my entire body. She committed financial fraud right in the middle of our active, highly contested divorce proceedings. Exactly, Richard confirmed. She thought she was being incredibly clever, hiding physical assets before the final legal division of the estate. But because she initiated that massive commercial loan, while the company was still technically a joint marital asset, it falls under strict financial dissipation laws. She crossed a massive, unforgivable legal line. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. They actually thought they could just pack their garbage bags and run away to a sunny beach to escape the total destruction they had caused. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked directly into federal jurisdiction. Draft the legal paperwork. Richard Y. ordered, my voice ringing with absolute uncompromising authority. I want an emergency subpoena issued immediately. We are dragging Patricia into a conference room for a sworn on the record deposition regarding the illegal dissipation of marital assets. I want to sit across the table and see the exact look on her arrogant face when she realizes she just traded her designer evening gowns for a federal prison jumpsuit. The corporate conference room of my law firm was intentionally designed to feel cold, sterile, and intimidating. Surrounding the long glass table were stark white walls, harsh overhead fluorescent lights, and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the gray Chicago skyline. I sat at the head of the table perfectly calm in my dark navy blazer, my hands folded neatly over a closed leather folio. Beside me sat Richard, my lead attorney who was methodically organizing a stack of color-coded legal briefs. Sitting across from us was Patricia. Despite having been served with an emergency subpoena just 12 hours earlier, my former mother-in-law had shown up looking predictably insufferably smug. She wore a tailored beige suit, her signature pearl necklace, and a sharp, mocking smirk. David sat in the chair next to her, looking hollowed out, disheveled, and completely broken after having his shipping yard repossessed and his home condemned. But Patricia was still riding a wave of pure delusion. She genuinely believed that her social status and family name made her completely untouchable. She smoothed her jacket, crossed her legs, and let out a dramatic, bored sigh. I really do not understand why you are wasting everyone's time with this ridiculous melodrama, Julia. Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescending superiority. If this is some pathetic attempt to drag us back into court because you are bitter about losing the house and the business, I suggest you give up now. You are only embarrassing yourself. Richard did not even look up from his papers. We are here today for a court-ordered sworn deposition regarding the illegal dissipation of marital assets prior to the finalization of your son's divorce decree, he stated flatly. Patricia laughed, a sharp, abrasive sound that echoed off the glass walls. Oh, please. You think you can intimidate me with fancy legal jargon? Let me save you the trouble. Whatever you think you found, you cannot touch my personal properties. I secured a gorgeous $2 million vacation home in Florida last month. The deed is registered entirely in my name. It has absolutely nothing to do with Julia, nothing to do with her little truck driving background, and nothing to do with your firm. You do not have a single shred of legal jurisdiction over my private assets. David nervously tugged at his collar, looking sideways at his mother. Mom, maybe you should let our lawyers speak, he muttered nervously. Patricia waved her hand dismissively, shutting her son down instantly. Quiet, David. I know how to handle people like them. They are bluffing. They have no money left and they are grasping at straws. I looked at Patricia, feeling a sudden deep sense of amazement at how blind arrogance can truly make a person completely foolish. She sat there bragging about a $2 million beach house, entirely convinced that her name on the deed was an impenetrable shield. I nodded subtly to Richard. Richard opened the leather folio and pulled out a thick black dossier stamped with the emblem of a major national commercial bank. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a grand speech. He simply slid the heavy folder across the polished glass table until it rested directly in front of Patricia. Let us discuss the paper trail for that Florida property, Mrs. Blackwell. Richard said, his tone dropping to a cold, clinical precision. You claim that the $2 million estate is your personal asset acquired through your own private financial standing. However, bank records tell a remarkably different story. Patricia sneered, refusing to touch the folder. I have excellent credit. No, you do not, Richard countered smoothly, opening his own copy of the dossier. You have no independent income, no liquid assets, and a credit rating that would not qualify you for a standard car loan. So how did a woman with zero personal capital secure a $2 million commercial mortgage from a federal bank in less than 48 hours? The smirk on Patricia's face flickered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered her composure. My son authorized a private family loan. Your son did not have the authority to authorize a sandwich, let alone $2 million, Richard said, flipping to the next page. 30 days ago, while the divorce proceedings between Julia and David were actively underway, a formal application for a high-yield commercial line of credit was submitted to First National Bank. The collateral listed for this $2 million loan was the operational credit of Julia's original logistics company, which was at that exact moment legally defined as an undivided joint marital asset. David's head snapped toward his mother, his face turning pale. "Mom, what is he talking about? What credit line?" Patricia's jaw tightened. She remained silent, glaring furiously across the table. "To secure that loan." Richard continued, leaning forward and tapping a specific document in the dossier. The bank required the explicit notarized signatures of both corporate officers, David Blackwell and Julia Blackwell. But Julia was never informed of this application, and David claims he knew nothing about it. "So we sent the signature page to a certified forensic handwriting expert this morning." Richard pulled out a high-resolution magnified photographic analysis and laid it on top of the folder. "The signatures on this federal loan application are complete fabrications," Richard revealed, looking directly into Patricia's eyes. "You forged your son's signature, and more critically, you forged Julia's signature. You illegally leveraged $2 million of active contested marital credit to fund your personal real estate purchase in Florida. You stole company capital to buy a beach house before the court could divide the assets." David gasped, burying his face in his hands. "Oh my God! Mom, what did you do?" "You shut your mouth, David," Patricia snapped, her voice finally losing its calm polish and rising to a panicked shriek. She slammed her hand on the table, glaring at me with pure hatred. "This is nonsense. It was a family business. I did what was necessary to protect our family's future from this scheming, ungrateful woman. I had every right to use that credit line. My son was the vice president. You had zero legal right." I finally spoke up, my voice calm, quiet, and completely cutting through her hysterics. "You committed identity theft, forgery, and grand larceny against a company I bled to build. You thought because you wore pearls and lived in a wealthy neighborhood, the law did not apply to you. You thought you could steal $2 million from me and just fly off to a sunny beach while I was left picking up the pieces. This is a civil matter." Patricia yelled, her face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of purple as she desperately tried to rewrite reality. "It is a financial dispute in a divorce case. My lawyers will have this thrown out of court by tomorrow morning. You cannot do anything to me." "Actually, Mrs. Blackwell," Richard interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal quiet, "you fundamentally fail to understand the severity of what you have done. Because you submitted forged signatures on a commercial loan application to an institution insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and because you transferred those fraudulent funds across state lines to purchase property in Florida, this is no longer a civil dispute." Richard closed his folder with a heavy, definitive thud. "By using interstate banking systems to commit financial fraud against an insolvent corporation, you have officially committed federal wire fraud and bank fraud. You did not just break state family law, you committed multiple federal felonies." The absolute total silence that followed was suffocating. The remaining color completely drained from Patricia's face, leaving her looking hollow, frail, and suddenly very old. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. The grand, arrogant illusion of her invincibility shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces right before our eyes. "Is that true?" David whispered, turning to look at his mother in absolute horror. "Tell me that is not true, Mom." Before Patricia could attempt another lie, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the conference room swung open with a sharp, heavy click. Two tall men wearing dark suits, pristine white shirts, and official government credentials pinned to their jackets stepped smoothly into the room. They walked with absolute unhurried purpose, the heavy soles of their shoes echoing against the floor. Behind them stood two uniformed law enforcement officers. "Am I speaking with Patricia Blackwell?" the lead agent asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Patricia froze in her chair, her eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. "Yes," she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "I am Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the man announced, pulling a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of bank fraud, wire fraud, and illegal transportation of stolen property across state lines." The agent stepped forward, unclipping the handcuffs. The cold metallic click of the steel mechanisms echoed loudly in the sterile room. Patricia let out a blood-curdling hysterical shriek as the officer grabbed her wrist, pulling her up from her chair and forcing her arms behind her back. "David! David, do something!" Patricia screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup as the steel cuffs snapped tightly around her wrists. "Call the lawyers. Tell them who I am. David, help me." David stood up, stumbling backward away from the table, looking at his mother with pure paralyzed horror. He did not move a muscle. He did not say a word. He simply watched, completely helpless, as his arrogant, untouchable mother was systematically stripped of her dignity, forced to walk past his ex-wife and hauled out of the room toward a waiting federal transport vehicle. David stood completely frozen in the sterile conference room, his eyes wide and vacant as the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the federal agents. The sound of his mother weeping echoed faintly down the long hallway, growing softer and more desperate, until the heavy elevator doors swallowed the noise entirely. He was left entirely alone with the wreckage of his own extreme arrogance. He slowly turned his head to look at me, expecting to see some shred of sympathy, some lingering trace of the obedient wife he had controlled for a decade. I simply closed my leather folio, stood up from the glass table, and told him he had exactly 2 minutes to vacate my law firm's premises before I had him arrested for trespassing. He stumbled out of the building like a ghost wandering through a graveyard. Over the next few days, David experienced the absolute crushing reality of total poverty. With his corporate accounts completely frozen by the federal government and his personal credit entirely destroyed, he could not even afford to rent a decent hotel room in the city. He was forced to sleep in the back seat of a cheap compact rental car parked in the dark, freezing corners of suburban strip malls. His mother was sitting in a federal holding facility, completely denied bail because her fraudulent Florida property purchase made her an extreme flight risk. The Environmental Protection Agency was officially levying daily compounding interest on his unpaid toxic cleanup bill, a number that grew larger with every passing hour. He had absolutely nothing, and no one left to manipulate. The high society friends he and his mother used to brag to would not even answer his frantic phone calls. On the fourth morning of his newfound homelessness, I was sitting perfectly comfortably behind the massive walnut desk of my new corporate headquarters. The bright morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating an executive office that was 3 times the size of the one David had tried to steal from me. I was reviewing the preliminary architectural designs for a massive new regional distribution hub when my desk phone rang. It was the head of my building security team. He informed me that a disheveled, highly agitated man was currently making a massive scene in the pristine granite lobby. The man was aggressively demanding to see the chief executive officer and frantically claiming he was my husband. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. I instructed the security guard not to call the police just yet. I told them to put the man in the private elevator and send him directly up to my executive floor. I wanted to see this. I wanted to witness the absolute final destruction of his towering arrogance with my own 2 eyes. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my office slowly pushed open. David shuffled into the room, and the sight of him was genuinely pathetic. The custom-tailored Italian suits he used to parade around in were completely gone. He was wearing wrinkled, heavily stained sweatpants and a cheap winter coat that looked like it had been slept in for days. His face was incredibly pale and gaunt, covered in thick, patchy stubble. His eyes were bloodshot and bruised with exhaustion, completely lacking the smug, predatory gleam that used to define his entire personality. He looked like a broken, desperate man who had finally realized he was entirely out of his depth. He did not march up to my desk to make aggressive demands. He did not puff out his chest or try to command the room with his usual fake authority. Instead, David walked very slowly to the center of my plush office carpet, his shoulders completely slumped. He looked around at the towering windows, the expensive modern art hanging on the walls, and the dozens of highly paid employees bustling outside in the corridor. He saw the massive, multi-million-dollar logistics empire I had built entirely without his useless interference. Then the man who had spent a decade treating me like uneducated dirt physically collapsed. David fell hard onto his knees right in front of my desk. He clasped his shaking hands together and began to beg. It was not a dignified plea. It was a messy, hysterical, completely humiliating display of pure desperation. He begged me to help him. He choked on his own tears, telling me he had made a terrible mistake, that he was blinded by his mother and manipulated by Brittany. He pleaded with me to remember the early days of our marriage back before the money and the overwhelming greed had completely poisoned his mind. He sobbed openly, looking up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. I told me he needed $2 million immediately. He begged me to use my massive new Omnicorp wealth to pay off the $800,000 environmental fine to keep the federal government from seizing his future wages for the rest of his life. He begged me to pay for an elite criminal defense attorney to bail his mother out of federal lockup before she was permanently transferred to a maximum security prison. He promised he would pay me back every single cent. He promised he would work for me, sweep the floors of my warehouses, wash my delivery trucks, do absolutely anything I wanted if I would just throw him a financial lifeline and save him from total ruin. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any sorrow for the man sobbing on my floor. I looked down at him and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated indifference. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool wood of my desk. I told him very calmly and very clearly that I do not buy toxic garbage. I told him I do not buy contaminated real estate. I do not buy bankrupt shell companies. And I certainly do not buy back cheating, manipulative men who try to destroy my life and steal my hard work. I told him his arrogant mother was going to rot in a federal prison cell, and he was going to spend the rest of his miserable life working minimum wage jobs just to pay off the interest on his massive environmental debt. I ordered him to get off his knees and get out of my corporate building before I had security throw him out into the freezing street. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous and genuinely terrifying. The moment David realized his tears were completely useless, the pathetic weeping facade evaporated entirely. The desperate sadness vanished from his bloodshot eyes in a fraction of a second, instantly replaced by a dark, vicious, and purely evil malice. His true narcissistic nature violently reasserted itself, stripping away the fake remorse to reveal the monster hiding underneath. He stopped crying immediately. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, brushing the invisible dust off his wrinkled winter coat. His jaw tightened, and a cruel, deeply unsettling smirk twisted the corners of his mouth. If he could not charm his way into my bank account, he was going to force his way in, using the most painful method possible. He decided to play his final absolute ugliest card. I took a slow step closer to my desk, leaning over the wood with a chilling, predatory calmness. He reminded me that while I might have won the company and successfully destroyed his mother, he still held one massive piece of legal leverage over my entire life. He reminded me of the original divorce settlement we had signed in that Chicago courtroom just a few short days ago. The exact same settlement where I had surrendered absolutely everything to protect my freedom and avoid his fabricated accounting ledgers. He reminded me that, legally speaking, he still held primary physical custody of our two young children, Leo and Mia. During the chaos of the last week, my mother had been keeping the children safely at her house, while David completely ignored their existence to focus on his stolen wealth. But on paper, he was still the primary custodial parent. His voice dropped to a sinister, threatening whisper that made my blood run completely cold. He told me that if I did not write him a cashier's check for $2 million by tomorrow morning, he was going to drive straight to their elementary school. He was going to pull them out of their classes using his legal custody rights, and the school administration would not be able to stop him. He told me he would pack my babies into his cheap rented car and drive them across state lines immediately. He smiled a sick, twisted smile and promised me that they would live out of his vehicle, sleeping in freezing parking lots and eating scraps. He swore to me that he would drag my precious children into his homeless, bankrupt nightmare, and I would never see them again unless I gave him the money to fix his ruined life. He was fully prepared to use his own flesh and blood as human shields to extort his way out of poverty. The air in my office went completely dead. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. I stared into the cold, empty eyes of the man I had once loved. I always knew he was incredibly greedy and deeply selfish, But threatening the safety, stability, and lives of his own young children just to extort money was a level of pure depravity I had not fully anticipated. My eyes darkened. A cold, lethal fury settled deep into my soul, solidifying my resolve into unbreakable iron. I did not scream at him. I did not panic or show him the fear he so desperately wanted to see. I simply nodded my head once. I told him to meet me in the downtown family court building tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for one final transaction. I promised him he would get his $2 million in exchange for full, irrevocable custody of the children. David grinned triumphantly, thoroughly believing he had finally found my breaking point and won the ultimate victory. He turned and walked out of my office with a renewed, arrogant swagger. As soon as the heavy glass door shut behind him, I picked up my phone and called Richard. It was time to prepare a ruthless, airtight legal trap from which David would never ever escape. The heavy wooden doors of the downtown family court building swung open precisely at 9 o'clock the next morning. I walked into the courtroom wearing a sharp charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, projecting absolute calm and unyielding authority. Richard walked right beside me holding a single thick manila folder. David was already sitting at the defendant table. He looked absolutely atrocious. He was still wearing the same stained, wrinkled winter coat from the day before. His face covered in thick, patchy stubble, but his bloodshot eyes were practically burning with manic, greedy anticipation. He truly believed he had beaten me. He genuinely thought that by threatening to kidnap our children and force them into homelessness, he had forced the powerful chief executive officer to bend the knee and surrender her wealth. Judge Harrison, a stern man with zero tolerance for nonsense, presided over the emergency hearing. He looked down at us from the elevated bench, clearly annoyed by the sudden, urgent nature of our meeting. He asked if both parties had reached an agreement regarding the final custody modifications. Richard nodded respectfully, stepping forward to present the paperwork. He informed the judge that David was prepared to voluntarily terminate his parental rights completely and grant me sole, irrevocable legal and physical custody of Leo and Mia. In exchange, I was prepared to present a certified cashier's check for exactly $2 million to settle his outstanding environmental debts and secure his mother's federal bail. The judge frowned deeply, looking directly at David with an expression of profound disbelief. He asked David if he fully understood the extreme gravity of the documents sitting in front of him. He asked if David comprehended that signing these papers meant he would have absolutely no legal right to seek contact or make any medical or educational decisions for his children ever again. He was legally erasing himself from their lives permanently. David did not even hesitate. He did not shed a single tear for the young children he was ruthlessly abandoning. He did not show an ounce of remorse or paternal hesitation. He just stared hungrily at the certified bank check resting on my side of the polished table. He told the judge he understood the terms perfectly. He grabbed a cheap plastic pen and began signing his name on every single dotted line with frantic, aggressive enthusiasm. Howe was eagerly trading his own flesh and blood for a massive financial bailout, and he was actually smiling while he did it. David threw the pen down, snatched the signed custody papers, and shoved them aggressively toward the court clerk. Then he held his shaking hand out toward me, demanding his money. I looked at him, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of peace wash over my entire soul. I slid the heavy paper check across the polished wood. David grabbed it instantly, his eyes devouring the printed zeros on the front. He laughed out loud right there in the quiet courtroom, bragging that I was always entirely too soft, that my love for the kids was my ultimate weakness, and that he would be on a direct flight to a sunny Florida beach by noon. But before David could even stand up from his wooden chair to make his grand exit, Richard cleared his throat. Richard stepped forward and politely handed a secondary, highly detailed financial disclosure document directly to the judge. Richard announced for the official court record that the $2 million check David had just enthusiastically accepted was not drawn from my personal banking accounts. It was not drawn from my corporate logistics revenue either. Richard explained with cold, clinical precision that the specific routing numbers on that cashier's check belonged to a protected, federally insured, irrevocable trust fund. It was a high-yield trust fund I had quietly established years ago, strictly and exclusively for the future benefit and education of Leo and Mia. The money in that account belonged entirely and legally to my minor children. David froze completely. The triumphant, arrogant smile slid right off his unshaven face. He looked down at the heavy check in his hand, suddenly realizing it was burning hot. Richard turned to look at David, his voice echoing loudly in the silent courtroom. By explicitly threatening to kidnap those children and force them into extreme poverty unless I paid him $2 million, David had committed textbook extortion. And by knowingly and willingly accepting a check drawn directly from their protected trust fund in exchange for abandoning his parental rights just to pay off his own criminal debts. David had just committed federal financial fraud against minors. The air in the courtroom vanished. Judge Harrison's face turned an alarming shade of purple. The stern judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot echoing off the marble walls. He stared at David with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust that could have melted solid steel. The judge immediately ruled that the custody forfeiture David had just signed was completely valid and legally binding, but the financial transaction was entirely void due to criminal extortion. He ordered the armed court bailiff to confiscate the $2 million check from David's trembling hands immediately. The judge did not stop there. He looked down from the bench and formally declared David an active, severe danger to the physical and emotional welfare of his children. The judge issued an immediate permanent lifetime restraining order. David was legally barred from ever coming within 500 feet of me, Leo Mia my home, or my corporate properties. Furthermore, the judge instructed the court clerk to forward the official transcripts of this specific hearing directly to the district attorney's office, strongly recommending immediate criminal charges for attempted extortion and attempting to defraud a minor's financial trust. David collapsed back into his wooden chair, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own destruction. He had walked into the courtroom fully expecting to walk out a millionaire without a single care in the world. Instead, he was leaving with no children, no money, a permanent restraining order, and the absolute guarantee of impending criminal prosecution. The legal trap was absolute. It was completely flawless. He had eagerly locked his own prison cell and handed me the only key. The dust finally settled a few months later, bringing a level of sweet, poetic justice that exceeded my wildest expectations. Patricia was officially convicted of federal wire fraud and bank fraud. Because of her advanced age and lack of prior criminal history, her expensive public defender managed to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. Instead, she was placed under strict permanent house arrest. She was forced to wear a bulky black ankle monitor at all times, confined entirely to a tiny, depressing one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. She was mandated by the court to complete hundreds of hours of grueling community service. The woman who used to brag about her designer gowns and expensive jewelry was now forced to pick up trash along the public highway in a bright neon orange vest, fully visible to the very high society neighbors she used to relentlessly mock. David suffered an equally devastating fate. With the Environmental Protection Agency actively garnishing every single cent of his wages to pay off his massive compounding toxic debt, he was completely unhireable in the corporate sector. His business reputation was entirely destroyed. The man who once wore Italian suits and aggressively demanded control of a multi-million-dollar empire was now working the overnight shift as a minimum-wage janitor. He spent his nights pushing a dirty push broom across the cold concrete floors of a low-rent distribution warehouse, taking harsh orders from a manager half his age. He lived in a cramped, moldy motel room right next to the noisy interstate, completely alone, with absolutely no way to ever contact the family he had so carelessly and cruelly thrown away. I stood on the massive wraparound glass balcony of my new corporate headquarters. The warm spring wind gently blew past me as I looked down at the sprawling, bustling city below. A massive fleet of bright, freshly painted delivery trucks rolled out of my main shipping yard, carrying my company logo across the country. Inside the luxurious executive suite behind me, the joyful sounds of Leo and Mia echoing through the halls brought a genuine bright smile to my face. They were sitting safely in my private lounge, coloring pictures and eating snacks completely shielded from the toxicity that had once threatened to consume our entire lives. My mother was sitting with them helping Leo draw a picture of a delivery truck finally enjoying the peaceful retirement she so deeply deserved. I raised my porcelain coffee cup, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my warm drink. I thought about the very first day in that terrible family court when I silently signed away a massive house built on toxic dirt just to buy my ultimate freedom. I had lost a broken, miserable marriage and a completely worthless, dangerous piece of real estate. But in return, I had gained an unbreakable business empire, absolute peace of mind, and the beautiful, undisputed ownership of my own destiny. The war was officially over, and the victory was infinitely sweet.